everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way Hey podcast. And today we're talking all things Ringwood Publishing with Chief Executive Sandy Jimison. Hello, Sandy.
Hello.
And one of Ringwood's authors, Dr. Anne Pettigrew. Hello, Anne.
Nice to be here.
Sandy, if we could start with you, could you give us a little bit of background to Ringwood Publishing?
Yes, about 20 years ago or so, a group of friends and myself came to an understanding of how very difficult it was for new Scottish authors to get published, and that it was nothing to do with talent, but it was to do with the changing priorities of established publishers and the growing accountancy domination of the publishing world, where you needed a name to guarantee sales, and if you were a new writer with no name, your chances of getting your first book published were virtually zero. So we decided, we formed a cooperative with a view to concentrating on giving first publishing opportunity to Scottish writers of quality who otherwise would not be published, and that has remained our priority over the years.
So it's mainly first novels or first books?
Well, yes, we start with the first novels of novelists, but because it takes time, even with a published novel, for the name to become known and the quality to become known, we also give our writers a guarantee that their subsequent books will be published too, subject to them being of the same acceptable quality. And we've always had a philosophy and a realisation that if any of our authors are particularly successful, bigger publishers like sharks will circle round the water and snap them up, and we offer all our authors a guarantee that if a bigger publisher does come in for them, we won't stand in the way of whatever contracts say or anything. And that's happened with 2 or 3 of our authors over the years. They've moved on, but we at least allow our authors to establish themselves with 2, 3, 4 books, and hope by then the word is out about them.
So you started this cooperative yourself and friends, and it was to publish your own, not just your own, but the group of people involved, their own work. Was that right? Yes,
but very quickly it spread to accepting submissions from. We've restricted it to, and there was some argument about this, but we've restricted submissions that we would consider to either Scots or people living in Scotland.
Okay, and 20 years ago, I'm trying to think what the publishing landscape was like back then. Was there a lot of other independent small publishers, or was it mainly your Canongate and the Polygon and the larger one?
There are remarkably few Scottish publishers of fiction, to the ludicrous position, and they're disappearing day by day.
Yes.
The ludicrous position a few years ago, Ringwood was the 3rd biggest contemporary fiction publisher in Glasgow, and then Freight swallowed Cargo and we became the 2nd biggest. Then Freight went bankrupt and we're now the biggest, which is a nonsense given how small we are, but it's a sad state of affairs.
It absolutely is. I actually worked for Cargo, and I completely understand that even then it was like even having 3 or 4 or 5 small publishers in the city was something to celebrate, and that kind of demise is such a shame. So Anne, how did you become involved with Ringwood?
Well, when I retired, I thought I would like to write a book. Then I discovered it was actually very difficult. And then I decided that I would have to go back to university because I had no idea how to structure a book. So I embarked on creative writing classes at uni at Glasgow, and I absolutely loved it. Tremendous tutors, Pamela Ross and Alan McMonigal, and a girl called Cathy McSporran, who's been seminal in the book. She's terrific. So Cathy took my book and said, well, get rid of the first 3 chapters and I think it's pretty good, which was very upsetting because my husband had already told me the first 3 chapters added nothing to it. So I finished this book, sent it out to people who seemed enthusiastic and started sending it off via the people listed in the Writers and Artists Yearbook, as I was told was the thing to do. So I sent it off to about a dozen agents and publishers, mainly in England, and got virtually nothing back, or else little things saying, oh well, maybe it might have some merit, but we can't do anything about it just now. So then I sent off to, I think, 6 or 7 Scottish publishers, every one of whom replied. 3 were very interested, but sadly met their demise and not long after they got the full manuscript. I don't think the 2 things were linked, but it is. And then I had very, very nice feedback from Berlin and from various other people. Cranachan and Saraband were very helpful, but they were very caught up with their wonderful book by Burnett, who won the big prize. So I'd started in the second one, and the computer bleeps up, I think, and it was said Ringwood Publishing, and the title was just Submission, and I thought, it's another one that, thank you very much, very good, but we haven't got room for it. So I think ignored it for a couple of days, and then opened my emails and it said, we really like this, can we have the whole manuscript? And then I met the wonderful Eleni, who's moved on to the higher things, and then I had a glass of wine in the Curlers, which features in the book with Sandy, and the rest is history. And I really like their ethos that it's non-profit. And some profits of my book are going to Plan, big children's charity pushing girls' education. So they've been great. Their editorial staff were very meticulous and picked up all sorts of things, and I couldn't say a bad word about them.
Which is handy.
Yes.
Well, that's a really interesting one in how writers find their publishers, because often they find, it seems to me, they do find the right publishers eventually, and when they work together, it's a good fit. From your point of view, Sandy, what are you looking for in a writer when you want to take them on board?
Quality is probably the first thing. There's a lot of misunderstanding generally about the kind of quality of books that are submitted to publishers, and most people assume most of them are rubbish. But in fact, our experience is almost all of them are competent, readable, of acceptable quality, and are as good as most books that are published in the world. But as a very small publisher, that level of competence and quality isn't enough for us. We need something slightly different, something slightly better, something that stands out in its own right and will have a chance of achieving the only real way we can sell books, which is relying on word of mouth. People read it, they tell other people this is a great book, and they need to read it, and that ripples out. But you need to have something exceptional for that to happen in any kind of scale. So we look for books that are high quality, but are also going to appeal to people and encourage people to read them too.
And in terms of spreading the word in that way, how have you found that that's changed? I know before we started I heard you talking about reviews online and putting on Amazon reviews and things like that, and I think people still don't quite understand how important that sort of thing is for writers. But how have you found that it's changed over the years?
It's changed quite dramatically, and maybe in a minute you could get Laurie to expand on the second point I'm going to make. But certainly you need an effective website to highlight your catalogue, because the number of people will Google Scottish publishers and come to their website. You need to be able to show them quickly the range that you've got and why they might be interested in them. But the second change over the years has been the growth of social media as a tool for promoting, and we use Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, but Laurie knows more about the mechanics of that than I do.
Well, since Sandy has mentioned Laurie and you sit in the corner, could you explain who you are and what your role is in Ringwood?
Hello, I'm the assistant managing director. So I've been for 5 months now. I've been trying to help Ringwood with the current state of the art social media plan, marketing plan, event planning. So we have a few interns helping us out and working directly with different authors each to work hand in hand with them, create events, help them with social media because most of them are not familiar with it, how it works, how to tag people, what kind of pictures to put online, how to talk about your own book, how to be able to use it in a sensible manner, which is something even I am struggling with, though I grew up with it. So I mean, I can understand for people that didn't grow up with it how hard it can be.
It's a side of things which is constantly evolving, I think. You could say, well, I understood that this week, and within a month's time something else has come along which has developed it further. And you said you did a writing course at Glasgow. Was that side of things ever mentioned?
Not at all. I did several courses at Glasgow. The main one was about planning and editing your novel and studying other novels. And I spent a lot of time reading other things. And my main problem was that I never thought at the beginning that you really need to be writing to a genre. If you want a big publisher, you do. And my book is a kind of coming of age. It's a nostalgic look at the 60s. It's got romance in it. It's got a bit of disposing of bodies in it. So it's a mongrel. And so as one agent in Edinburgh who I was put on to by Berlin, I think, said to me, the problem is I'm not sure where we'd market this. Yes. Because it's a mongrel. My second book, which I'm just editing, is much more a murder mystery in a way. So this one was more difficult because it was a 2-decade saga, really.
Yeah.
So no, that wasn't mentioned. I was already on Facebook, and I'd done a lot of writing for the Herald and Medical Press and stuff, and did a bit of radio work for the BMA and Life Writing Centre, things like that. But years ago. And in a way, if I had written the book on top of that, it would have been much easier to market because a lot of people have died off now. And I was 68 when Sandy and the crew offered me this contract. So it was a steep learning curve to try and master Instagram. And I'm trying different things, and it's interesting to see the response. You can even see a response in the sales after one Instagram. And it's curious to find that there are doctors in Russia and Mexico and things looking at it. So I found it a very steep learning curve. I'm still not very good, but I know if Laura says she likes a post that I've done, then that one's okay.
You're doing well. You're
doing
okay? Better than most.
Because it's to get the book out there, which I realised is very difficult because I was used to doing stuff for the BME and getting almost instant responses, press conferences and things. And a book from a small publisher by some retired, presumably slightly nutty ex-GP is quite hard to market.
I think it's an interesting background though, because my family background's in medicine as well, and there are many of my dad's friends who have said, I wish I'd written that book, but you actually did it. Well, so you've got all these people who wish they'd done it, who probably are dying to read yours.
I wouldn't have. I don't think I could have written the book the way it is if I hadn't gone off and done a sabbatical at Oxford at 52. Right. And I did medical anthropology, and I had to stand back and look at medicine from the outside, or as my tutor said, I had to be deconstructed. Which sounded a bit painful. But it does mean that I could be critical in it of things that were then very wrong, many of which have changed, particularly the views on women, homosexuality and the career moves. And I left hospital and went into general practice, which I loved, because there was no way you could get part-time work. And I decided suddenly at 29, my biological clock said, I think I want a baby, so the kids came first, so I went into practice.
I was reading your kind of bio on the website, and it said that you wanted to entertain and not write great literature, whatever that means. Well, I can't.
I'm too old, and I'm too long away from that kind of thing. Though I was encouraged, there's one chapter in the book, which is kind of the seminal chapter of the book, where there's unrequited love declared, someone admits they burnt a body in an incinerator and all this sort of stuff. And that book got an A from someone at uni that I thought was a really hard taskmaster. So I thought, this book will be published, so I finished it. But it's it does contain a lot of me. There are some things that are true. I mean, my husband and I were invited to a free love party in a hospital that will remain nameless. And I was groped at the final year dinner. So, I mean, there are things in it that are true and stories that were given to me by other people that I didn't believe. But it is a story, and it's the kind of book I like to read because it's got a lot of characters in it. Some of the editors thought too many characters in it, and a lot of things happen. But it gives a coloured picture of Glasgow, the NHS, and the state of women. There are no books about women doctors.
Yeah.
They're only token ones in Doctor in the House, or they're pioneers, or they're pathologists like Tess Gerritsen and stuff. So there's not really any books about women doctors.
I'm interested in this idea that you're told increasingly you have to fit a genre to fit on the correct bookshelves in Waterstones or whatever like that. Sandy, reading the kind of themes that you have on the front page of the website, you have politics, football, religion, 3 things that you're told not to touch in this city in particular, and then money, sex and crime. And I like the fact that you put crime at the end. But in terms of Ringwood, is that something that you had to think about? You thought, no, if this is good, if it's quality, we are going to publish it.
Yeah, I mean, it was an awareness amongst the initial group that these were the key issues around Scotland. Politics, religion, football, which is the main Scottish cultural dominant form, and you never get away from sex, money and crime anyway. So we
all the bases are covered.
Rather than avoid these, we would face it and say we would welcome submissions that tackle all these issues in a Scottish context. And
in terms of the submission process as it is now for Ringwood, is it just a case of people, I mean, is it set out on the website?
It's set out in the website. We have a separate email address, submissions@ringwoodpublishing.com, and we ask that manuscripts be sent to us. We quickly dispensed with the sort of traditional publishing thing, send us 3 chapters and we'll decide. We quickly found that was nonsense.
Right.
We wanted a rounded picture of what the book was, so we asked for a draft, not the final draft, because obviously there'll be a lot of work done, but a draft that goes from the beginning to the end, that gives us an opportunity to assess whether that book has the potential that what we are looking for.
And Anne, you mentioned there briefly that some editors thought that maybe you had too many characters, and I've, as someone who edited previously, I know that relationship can be tense at times. How have you found that kind of a relationship?
Well, no, there wasn't really any tension. I think the only kind of problem I saw, which we solved after a while, was that relationships between particularly guys and girls were quite different in those days. And they quite often would say, well, can you say that? I said, well, you couldn't say that nowadays, but you could be very critical, or men would say that to women in 1967 when the book starts, the Summer of Love. Not that Glasgow was in any way a swinging 60s city. So no, I mean, it was all very amicable, and they came up with things, and they would find that I had misnamed someone. I mean, at one point I had a character visiting this old lady, and I was told, well, he can't. And I said, well, why can't he? Well, because he died 2 chapters before. You put the wrong name. It's not Frank, it's James. You know, so little things like that, because when you're continually editing, even if you read it out, as I was taught, you can make mistakes. But when I saw the Ringwood website, because I did the research on everyone before I submitted, and I saw that they had their 6 things, I got everything except politics, and I think we've always enough of politics just now, because it takes in the Ibrox disaster for the football. There's certainly a fair bit of sex. One of the girls did think I should augment sex scenes, but I said, no, just use your imagination. I'm short of word count. And certainly the money and the other things that they list as being Scottish obsessions or interests are in the book. So I thought, well, maybe it does fit. I'll send it off.
And you said, Sandy, that you find that a lot of the books that get sent to you are actually this myth that there's lots of terrible writing being sent around the place is a bit of a myth, and I completely agree with you that actually there's a lot of good writing out there that just hasn't been given the chance. Do you think that's at all to do with the kind of growth of writing classes, or do you think that was always the case?
I suspect it's always been the case, but it was easier in the past for really good writing to find a publisher. It's certainly much more difficult, and given the growing numbers of people who are writing, instead of being one in a relatively small pool, even very good books are one in a large pool, and it's much harder. We try to be realistic with people whose books we are not going to publish. We use phrases like, just because it's not suitable for us doesn't mean it won't be suitable for other publishers. And particularly books that get past their first stage, we say we recognise the merit of this book, but on balance it's not one we want to proceed with, but we'd encourage you to keep on trying.
On you go.
No, I was just going to say that I believe there's something like 100,000 books produced worldwide. Of course, that includes a lot every year, which includes a lot of non-fiction, obviously, as well. But if you really want to be a success, you have to be probably on Love Island or something, write a book and have a big celebrity following. That's the way things have gone, I think.
And when you first started sending it out to publishers and you got the thanks but no thanks kind of letters, you clearly didn't let it put you off, and you said you had belief that this book would find a home.
Yes, well, I think my belief, and the people round about me who'd read, a lot of which were friends, but some of whom were friends of friends and had no reason particularly to say we think this is good, was the fact that there wasn't anything recording this kind of experience of women in medicine. Because I think people have thought for a long time that it's a very equal field. And I mean, in 1967, only 34-35% of the intake was women. And when I went to Greenock as a GP, I was the only sort of full-time female GP. There was one other person in the area who did sessions, but at all the meetings and everything, it was just entirely men. And I was actually told at the first lunch I went to that women had no place in medicine, and that if Hades' way they would be barefoot, pregnant and in the kitchen. So I mean there's a lot of stuff in it which is really true, and I felt it needed recorded, and that the best way to do it, because I couldn't have done a book like Andrew Kay's great book about being a junior doctor, because I didn't want to mention people's names or you know, so everything has changed. There are terrific clinicians that taught me who are in the book as someone else. But other than them, the characters are all made up.
What I often find when people do fictionalised accounts of things, have you had people saying, that's me, isn't it?
Well, a number of my year who came to the reunion, well, the first comment was one of the boys said, I never got my leg over when I was there. You know, how did this happen? You know, what was I missing? And I said, look, it's a story, Jim, it's a story. But I think there are some people who've read it just to see who it is, but no one is recognisable that I've used as a template. I invented the characters and I lived with them for about 4 months before I started writing, so I knew everything about them.
I think you said that you got to know the characters as you were writing them. The first 3, it wasn't you. You didn't come with an idea of like, here's the structure of my first 3 chapters or anything like that. It was like, where are these people going to take me?
Yes, I think that we had like Ringwood had themes, I had themes, that the dynamics that affected us were private and state schooling, were religious differences even, because the Protestants and Catholics in Glasgow don't meet in school. There were various other themes which were the themes of race and sexual proclivity and gender. So these themes were in the back of my mind, and I had a thing pinned up in front of me with things I want, you know, as I went, you know, have I brought that out? So it was trying to give, I think it's George Eliot who said that a novel should try to be the best account of the moral complexity of the day. Sounds a bit pompous, but I was told that at one of the writing classes, and I had that written up. It was a time of totally changing sexual and social mores. Everything. I mean, women didn't go into pubs, you know, women didn't have sex for marriage, women couldn't get the pill if they were on the NHS, if you were unmarried, with no mobile phones, research with cards in a library, you know, discussing that. Laura was there, I talked with students at university today, and they think this is just a very alien world. They're quite interested in it.
And I guess there's social moral complexities of that time, but in medicine there's a different set of moral complexities as well.
And medical ethics is a big theme of it. And in fact, the two books, the first one really is about the ethics of ambition being not just fame and fortune and getting as many women as you can because people think you're a high-powered surgeon. And the second book is really about the duty of care and the power of life over death, which doctors have, which increasingly we find little snippets saying that it is abused here and there, not just with Harold Shipman. There's been a few lately as well.
Sandy, could you talk a little bit about some of your other writers? Because you've kept it a kind of small group of writers. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we're constrained by our size. And can I make one point,
of course,
which sums the thing up? We're sometimes referred to as a not-for-profit publisher. We are not a not-for-profit publisher. We are a publisher who never makes a profit, which is significantly psychologically different. But our aim only is that each book washes its face and the money from it finances a subsequent book. So we could never, for example, bring out 5 or 6 books at the one time. We aim to publish between 6 or 8 a year, and that ticks over. But it's given our philosophy of giving our signed up authors a commitment to publish the future books, the numbers of second books and third books reduces the number of new books, so we don't rapidly expand our pool of authors.
And do you think that's perhaps why you have survived, where others, and we've mentioned a couple of them earlier on, have not? This, for some companies, not just in publishing but in other areas as well, there seems to be this great desire to expand exponentially, and actually that's where things go wrong. It happens in the restaurant world. I've seen that happen as well. Is that something that you've thought, no, let's not go beyond the means here?
Yeah, well, we've in 20 years we've never had an overdraft or never been in deficit, but we've never had more than a few £1,000. So frankly, I do not understand how any publisher survives, and in fact most of them only survive because they're subsidised by other branches of the conglomerate that they're members of. And it's been heartbreaking to see publishers like Freight who try to be a bit more ambitious and then plunge the ground. We only survive basically for one reason: we've got a group of committed people who run it while doing other jobs, so therefore they don't take salaries, and that includes me in that group. And we are only able to operate the scale we are because we rely on interns, both full-time interns like Laurie and a group of part-time interns who help with the editing and copywriting, marketing and development. If we paid the going rate for all these staff, we would have been bankrupt in 6 months.
Right. That's
so
really
we
interesting.
exploit people with the best will in the world, but the only reason we can sleep at night for doing that is because publishing is now such a cutthroat business. Even bottom tier jobs get 400 or 500 applicants.
Yes,
and if you don't have relevant experience, you won't even get interviewed, far less point. So we have quite a good track record of giving our interns very relevant experience, because in many publishing, interns make the tea, do the filing and work their way through the bottom end of the slush pile. In Ringwood they get real responsibilities, editing, copywriting, promoting.
So real skills and experience.
So that experience gets them in, and we've got a good record of our interns becoming members of bigger publishers. For example, the managing directors couple before Laurie now works for HarperCollins. Others work in bigger publishers in Scotland and in England. But without that group of very talented, very committed young people being prepared to do these jobs for nothing, we couldn't survive.
And I might interject here and say that the well, largely girls, but there's some lads too that I've had. I mean, they're very highly qualified in what they've done, you know. So it's not that you've been lucky; you've been very clever at who you've chosen. And there are many people with extremely good degrees who are working for them and who have a very enthusiastic. I think that's another thing. I know people who've been with bigger publishers, and there's not the enthusiasm or the will to get back to you immediately, or to be frank and say, no, that's nonsense. I don't think you can say that.
Or even just the relationship, I think, with a writer. You know, if one editor's looking after multiple writers, then it is difficult. Whereas if you've got a more of a one-to-one relationship, I think that can be greatly important. So that's, as was mentioned at the beginning, you've been going for 20 years. What kind of changes have you seen over those 20 years in publishing? We've spoken about social media and that side of things.
When we first started, the pattern for almost all publishers was about 95% at least of their books were sold through trade sources, i.e. they were sold in bookshops. As a small publisher, from the beginning we found it extremely difficult to get into bookshops, particularly since Waterstones, when we started, Waterstones managers were allowed to order books. That I could walk into a bookshop with a case of 20 books and sell them to the manager. But they introduced a system where ordering was done centrally for the whole of Scotland. But even worse, any books ordered from a Scottish publisher have to be sent to England to then be distributed to the Scottish bookshops. So it's madness. Instead of me going half a mile into the city centre and hand books over, these books do a 500-mile round journey, and the control of ordering is removed from the local shops. So it's been much harder since we started to get into places like Waterstones. And now trade sales through bookshops are a small percentage of our overall sales. Most of our sales are either internet through our website, internet through Amazon, or through direct sales through events that we organise and promote. And that's been a major change.
I think increasingly, hopefully, people are beginning to realise that, and you might agree with me or not, that the best place to buy, whether it's books or whether it's music or anything like that, is from the people themselves, because that's where most of the money then goes, whereas everywhere else, some places, as we know, is a huge take. And
Don't get me started on that.
I haven't even mentioned them. Yes.
I'd just like to say something, and that is I'm quite hampered by trying to get local sales due to the fact that in Inverclyde there is not a single bookshop. There's a small W.H. Smith in Largs. There is nothing between us and Paisley.
Is that right?
Yes,
Wow.
there's nothing. And there's some small shops, sort of little second-hand shops and stuff, but there's nowhere to market my book in my whole area, which is a pity because I had 10,000 patients, but who I might be able to put a picture on and say, oh, this is my book.
Yeah.
There's nowhere, and it's a big. I mean, that's why I'll pick up books when I'm in Waterstones and Argyll Street, but it's not.
The other major change since we started is the e-books, and we now, we always have simultaneously to launching books in paperback, because we quickly decided the hardback market was for dinosaurs. We've never produced a hardback book, and all our books are called original paperbacks, but we simultaneously produced them in ebook. and that opens up the possibilities for the doctors in Russia and Australia and the Scottish diaspora and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. We do a significant percentage of our sales are e-books, and funnily enough, we make as much profit from an e-book as we do from a paperback.
That is
Because
interesting.
the production costs are virtually zero.
Yeah.
We've already done all the editing and everything else. And with the increasing commission that bookshops take and that Amazon take, we actually get more from selling an e-book for £5 than we do for selling a paperback for £10.
That's very interesting. And I know you said that's with we were talking about medical dramas being written by women being rare. Have you found that there's been a reach around the world from that?
Yeah, well, certainly I know of people who bought it in Australia and Canada and whatever, but the e-book, to me, I mean, I like a physical book, but for many people, e-books are the way to go. They read and travelling, and even audiobooks. I've got a friend who's considered helping me with that, and I know my daughter in London, a lot of her friends, they plug into a book, you read it when you're commuting, rather than carrying a physical book or carting about a Kindle or an iPad. But I think that the e-books do have their place. They said that e-book sales were falling and book sales were rising, but I think the e-book is here to stay. And it went out before my paperback did.
Yeah.
And I can, you don't get the actual figures, but you can see the graph on, although that can become addictive and it changes every 2 hours, so you can get very upset.
Yes, all of these analytics can become addictive.
Yes, but no, I think e-books are here to stay, and I think it's doesn't, to my point, doesn't supplant a proper physical book.
No, I think like a lot of these things that finds a plateau. You know, we were told a few years ago that Kindle was going to be the king, and the book was on its way out on the printed word, and I think that's turned out not to be the case. Something that's been going for as long as the printed word is not going anywhere soon, and it's interesting to hear recently that magazines are making a comeback after kind of falling off the edge. You mentioned events, Sandy, that you also sell books through events. What sort of events are putting on? Are we talking about book launches or?
Yeah, our basic model starts with a physical book launch. Many publishers have abandoned physical launches because they were getting half a dozen people attending if they were lucky. But for us, given that we're almost exclusively talking about first-time authors, the book launch is actually a big event.
Yes, absolutely.
It's important, and people's family and social network want to support them at the launch. So we always go with a bang launch, and we find that normally sells enough books to recover all the production costs, and then thereafter we're relying on internet sales and trade sales. But over the last couple of years we've started trying to organise more events, maybe around about themes. For example, we have several books by women about different family models, and we had an event recently where the three authors of these books about extremely different family models came and spoke, and we sold a fair number of books there. But Laurie's in charge of our marketing. Maybe she should see some
I'd
of
be
the plans
interested
we've
in
got.
how you see book marketing at the moment, because it's as Sandy says often, that the old-fashioned book launch, particularly if it's someone that's on their third or fourth book and they've kind of worn out the friendships and things like that. How do you see it changing?
Book launches are big for the author and for the friends. It's a great event, but then that's just the beginning. Then you have to market it on the long run, which is harder. And the events, we try to find something original, a theme, to have a question. People like to be to have a specific theme to be discussed. They like to get out there and to talk about books and to bring friends. I mean, we think that it's quite lost, but in the end it works. We just need to find the right person to market it to and to get it out there, and people will get out. Especially in Glasgow, I mean, for a pint, people will move.
If you find the right place, that's right. Venues are very important. But what about in getting involved in festivals? I think there are now more book festivals in Scotland than there have ever been before. Is that something that's easy to get into as a small publisher or not?
No, definitely not.
There's a lot of shaking of the heads going on.
Yeah, we have a list of all the festivals and book prizes, but it's more and more difficult to get into it. There are always deadlines that you somehow miss, even though you were looking forward to it. You need to go through specific qualifications in order to be able to be there. And for example, Anne's book was, I mean, we were thinking of crime festivals, but it doesn't fit because it's not properly crime. So
Second one will be okay.
I mean, that's why it's difficult, because I mean, they're so specific that, I mean, if you have an original book that goes a bit all over the place with very different themes, you can't really market it for that kind of festival.
Yeah.
One other thing that really surprised me when I looked, because I was looking at books which had won prizes and things, I'm looking at putting books in. My book was runner-up in a Scottish Association of Writers prize last year, called the Constable Silver Star. But a lot of these other things, when you actually read the requirements and you get done, a lot of them require a lot of money. Publishers put a lot of money up for a lot to enter books into these things.
Yeah.
It's just not on for a small publisher. And there are many, many marketing things that require a lot of money.
Yeah.
Even if we found, because it's always your secret fantasy, you're going to find this novel that's going to win the Booker Prize. Even if we found that book of that quality, we couldn't afford to enter it in the Booker Prize. At the later stages, it's
$7,000.
That's our budget for the next 3 years.
Yes, the hidden costs that people just don't realise.
No, it's like people don't realise how important reviews are. And to be honest, until I started writing, I only ever put a review on if I absolutely adored a book. Whereas now, if I really think it's got something interesting to say, I'll put a review on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hugely important for writers to get, because apart from anything else, people check them out, but also on certain websites, which we won't mention, the kind of algorithms of just having a 5-star or a 4-star review takes it into another level as well. It's a complicated business.
Algorithms, because one of the major changes, certainly, since when I was a boy, it seemed like almost every novel got a review in the local or national press. Most newspapers have stopped reviewing books altogether, and even the so-called more intellectual ones, the Herald and the Scotsman, have drastically reduced the numbers of books they review, and they give priority to the big names and the big publishing houses.
Yeah, that's right.
We find it extremely difficult to get our local national paper, the Herald, to review our books. But there's a new literary editor there, and we're hoping she'll have a more democratic approach.
But I know that the reviews in the Scotsman, which I think used to be a page or a double page, have gone down to like a tiny little section, which I think is crazy, because there are still people who love to read and are looking for the next new thing to read, and it's very short-sighted in my opinion. So you've mentioned that your next book is going to be crime, Anne. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or is that...
No. Well, as I say, the first book, there's a villain. It was a couple of villains, but one's more evil than the other one, and he's into fame and fortune and ladies. The second book concerns the same protagonist, narrator, Beth, a girl from Govan, and she is now working as a GP in Bearsden and Mulgai, and she starts suspecting that one of the local doctors is not what he seems, and there are certain suspicious deaths which she brings to the attention of the police, who visit the chap and think it's all hunky-dory and that she's obviously off her head and they do nothing about it. And that mirrors, in fact, what happened with Shipman, because a female GP and a local funeral director went to the place saying, not only does this guy seem to have more deaths than usual, but he's had several in his surgery. And I don't know anyone who has had a death in the surgery.
Right, that's
very
interesting.
rare.
Right.
So that follows her, and it involves her young family, her teenage girls as well, the story. And I think it's of great interest to Glasgow as well. But it does make you, as I was doing it, I realised how many ways there are to probably kill somebody and not be detectable. Although you have to watch what you search for with Google's algorithms. I was obviously researching lots of poisons and things, but then at one point I was trying to find out where the saunas were in Edinburgh for part of the plot, because my husband's a long time since he lived in Edinburgh. He went to Heriot Watt. And after that I was playing a game of solitaire on my iPad one night, and up comes, well, I won't say on air what it was it said, but it was adverts for local sex things. And I thought, how have I got that? And it was at the Writers' Group in Glasgow. They said, have you been researching something about saunas? Or I said, yeah, well, that's where it's come from.
There'll be people listening to this still, that'll be my excuse. I'm researching a book, don't you know? And Sandy, what's your plans for the future for Ringwood? Is it just continue what's happening?
Well, very interesting. We had a board meeting last night where the board asked themselves exactly that question, and there was a lot of debate and discussion, because it is very, very hard for a publisher our size, and we cannot grow, and if we shrink then we disappear, so
sure.
It's a very difficult balance, but certainly we're hoping to continue the sort of three strands. New books by first authors of quality. We're bringing one out, Inference, in July, which will prove, I think, very interesting, a sort of gaslighting in Scotland book. So that's one strand. The second strand is follow-up books by our existing writers, and we've got a couple completed by Charlie Charkey and Alec Gordon, who's a famous football writer but also writes fiction, and then hopefully there'll be a new wave of Anne and Frank Woods and other of our authors now currently writing their second book. And the third strand, we started off exclusively as fiction, but we realised that Scottish themes encompass non-fiction, and we've produced 2 or 3 very good, very interesting and quite well-selling non-fiction books. One about walks in Islay related to the geology of the island, one about one of our authors who climbed every Munro in Scotland in 49 days, which is quite an effort. He's a legend in the hill walking community, and that book has sold very well, because everybody in Scotland thinks they're capable at least of climbing 1 Munro. But the thought of doing 7 a day for 7 weeks is just mind-blowing, and the book captures that. But in the next few months we're quite excited. We're going to bring out, which is something similar to that, called A Whisky Odyssey of an ordinary man, not a specialist in drink or anything, who walked and travelled around every distillery in Scotland, and he's written up his findings and produced several whisky routes. So we expect there to be a lot of interest in that book.
I thought you were going to say 7 whiskies a day for 7.
If you take the route seriously, that's what's involved.
That's what's involved.
Rather healthier.
Well, you have to walk.
You have to walk to them.
And that sounds like my husband's birthday present, Sandy. I'll take the first copy.
Well, I think that is the perfect place to leave it. So thank you very much, Laura. Thank you, Anne. And thank you, Sandy, for joining us today. And we will be back soon with somebody completely different. Cheers.